Wonderful. Welcome, everyone, on this rainy Friday here in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us. We have a great lineup here for you today. We have a lot of content to fill, so I'm going to go through some housekeeping items just while folks take a minute or two to log on to our sessions here today. So first, our most common questions: is this recorded? It absolutely will be recorded, and we'll share out with anyone who can't stay on for the full time or who wants to share with their colleagues or anything like that. We want this to be a question-driven session, so feel free to use the chat and Q&A boxes to participate in this conversation and share your questions with our panelists today. And then finally, just a reminder of our agenda here. So at 12 o'clock right now, we're kicking off with our speakers talking about the House of Representatives. At 1 o'clock, we'll be jumping on to talk about the Senate, and 2 o'clock about the executive branch. So you can stay on this link all afternoon and chat with us about the results that we've seen over the past few days. As you know, there's lots going on, so we're going to have plenty to talk about. For those who aren't familiar with Quorum, before we dive in, we are a public affairs software company based in Washington, D.C. Our tools help public affairs teams at corporations, trade associations, nonprofits manage things like legislative tracking, grassroots advocacy, stakeholder engagement, and newly PAC management and policy communications. So if after this webinar, anyone's interested in learning more, please visit our website at quorum.us. Now, to dive into the House so we can get the most out of it, because the House, I think, is one of the most interesting and probably unexpected stories coming out of this Tuesday. We have two fantastic speakers. I think I could spend our whole session talking about their accomplishments, but I'll just give brief bios here. First, we have Kathryn Lehman, who prior to entering private practice, Ms. Lehman served as Chief of Staff for the House Republican Conference. Her career began as counsel on the House Judiciary Committee staff, where she served 8 years. She later served as special assistant to then Speaker Newt Gingrich, as policy director to House Majority Whip Tom DeLay, and director of coalitions and outreach for Speaker J. Dennis Hastert. Next, we also have Karl Koch. Prior to joining Holland and Knight, Mr. Koch served 4 years as chief of staff to Congressman Jim Davis. His career in public service began in 1988 with his work with former U.S. Representative Buddy MacKay. In the 90s, he worked on both campaigns for the late Governor Lawton Chiles, serving as the director of the re-election campaign in 1994. Went on to serve as chief of staff for then Lieutenant Governor Buddy MacKay. Mr. Koch gained national exposure as the Florida director for the Clinton-Gore presidential re-election campaign in 1996. So now I'm going to pull up a few slides that Kathryn and Karl will walk us through, and then we will open the floor to questions. So give me one moment here, and I will pull our slides up. And all right, and Karl and Kathryn, you can just give me the cue for when we want to jump from one slide to the next, and I will turn it over to you.
Go ahead, Kathryn, why don't you lead us off here?
Well, I'm going to lead us off with a caveat that it is, and I shouldn't admit this, but I will. It's still possible that Democrats could get to 218. As Karl and I discussed this morning, the runway is getting very short. I think it's more likely that Republicans end up with a very thin majority, maybe it could even be 218, which my understanding is hasn't happened since 1930. But I do still think they get it. So we're going to assume that happens, because if that does happen, and I think it will happen, change is what people are interested in. Teresa, can you go to the next slide? Yeah. So where we are now is Democrats are at 198, Republicans at 211. We have 26 races uncalled. I'm just going to start with the sense that Republicans had that we would do a lot better. We'll drill down on that in a minute. I mean, Republicans were fighting in districts that were contending in districts that were more a lot of D plus this, D plus that. Probably D+1 to D+5, and in some cases up to D+12, and really fell short in a lot of those races. I think I will say, as someone who looks at the polls and the trends of, Wasserman and 538 and Nathan Gonzalez, in the last 2 weeks, you really did see a lot of races moving from lean Democrat to either likely Democrat to lean Democrat or lean Democrat to toss up. So I think people were anticipating that trend line would continue. And quite frankly, it really didn't. This was more of a hand-to-hand combat election than a wave election. And let's just go to the next slide. Let's just go to the next slide. So this is where we are right now. Democrats lead. They have 198. They lead in 15 seats. That would bring them to 213. Republicans lead in 211. Leading in 11 seats, that would lead to, we'd finish up with 222. If you look at some of these races, there's a couple where I think it's possible for the Democrats to overtake the Republican. In California, 13, the old harder seat. Republican leads by 267 votes, up from 203 with 58% in Maryland, 6. David Trone is still behind, but there's a lot of Montgomery County votes to be counted. So you can see there what's still outstanding. And hopefully, as you can see, a lot of these are West Coast, except for, I would say, New York, and then Maine. Of course, Maine is ranked choice voting, and that's Jared Golden and Bruce Poliquin. And last time, I think Bruce Poliquin was leading, and then they went to ranked choice, and Golden beat him. So that's kind of where we are. Karl, you want to say anything on this slide?
No, I think Kathryn's right. Obviously, as she mentioned, we talk about this all the time. And the reason why there's so much uncertainty right now is because there's only a handful of races left. And the majority, regardless of which way it goes, is going to be razor thin. So you are actually dealing with every single House race counting and determining who is going to be in the majority party going forward. That's why there's so much drama behind what we're dealing with right now.
All right, next slide. So we actually, I think there's a number of factors impacting House races. Karl, you want to talk about redistricting?
Sure. I mean, redistricting, as we all know, a year ago, there was a lot of angst among Democrats about how bad redistricting was going to be for Democrats. It didn't really turn out that way. There were a couple of states that overreached, New York and Maryland being 2 of them, and where the courts came in and drew different maps, especially in New York, that were not favorable to Democrats. But by and large, redistricting, I think at the end of the day, is going to be pretty close to being a wash in terms of the outcome here. We always have new races. We always have new seats. And so we always end up with a process where you don't know what the outcome is going to be because you have entirely new seats. Florida, in my home state, did a very good job of doing their redistricting, did not get beat down by the courts yet. But I mean, I think by and large, Democrats did not lose redistricting in any level the way people thought they were going to.
And then, of course, the other factor was the next factor we think was the Dobbs decision, where, earlier this year, Republicans, it was going to be a red wave. And then the Dobbs decision kind of put a break on that. My own view is it wasn't as decisive as we thought it was going to be. However, at the margins, it did make a difference, especially because a lot of the seats where Republicans were fighting are what we call marginal seats. So they're in the D+3 to R+3 range. So not a whole lot of people can really make a difference in an election. Karl, you want to talk about Dobbs a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think the outcome of Dobbs was, I mean, you took an incredible enthusiasm gap between Republicans and Democrats, and you closed that enthusiasm gap. Did it bring the enthusiasm gap to even? Maybe not, but at the end of the day, that probably wasn't necessary for Democrats anyways. Dobbs increased enthusiasm, and you saw that in the Kansas statewide ballot initiative. You saw that in the New York race. You saw that in races where choice really was starting to play a major factor, maybe not the top factor, but a major factor in people's decisions as to how they were going to vote. I think at the end of the day, when you look back on some of these polls that got it wrong, we're going to realize that they probably were not reflecting choice intensity, especially among women, suburban women, and what kind of factor it was going to play with them in terms of how they were going to vote.
And one other thing I want to say about polls quickly is in 2020, everybody thought Democrats would pick up 15 seats, and what ended up happening is Republicans picked up 14 seats. And then in 2016, the sense was that there was an undercounting of Republican voters, and that's why the poll showed that Trump was going to lose, and he ended up winning. So my guess is, as we look at the history books on this, that it's possible that some of the pollsters sort of looked at their mix of what they thought the turnout would be, and might have gotten a little higher with their Republican numbers than with their Democrat numbers, just because, they'd screwed it up before, and they're just trying to figure out how this is all going to work. So I will talk about Trump being a factor, and I think he was a big factor. I'm sure you've read the stories in the last couple days. I think Chris Christie said this. He won in 2016, he lost in 2018, he lost in 2020. His party lost the Georgia Senate races, and now in 2022, he endorsed 5 House candidates. My understanding is they all lost. And part of the problem is Trump is still relitigating his 2020 loss and endorsing candidates who agree with that view. And you could really see this. I don't want to get into the Senate world, but you could see this, especially in Pennsylvania, where Trump endorsed Mastriano for governor. He lost by 14 points. We had 3 winnable seats in Pennsylvania. We lost them all. In New Hampshire, Sununu won the governor's race by 16 points. Trump endorsed Don Baldick. He lost by almost 10 points. So I don't think it's a stretch to say that his endorsement in statewide races were a drag on House races, even if there was no Trump endorsed candidate in those races. And when it comes down to it, it's all about the independents. And this election was all about the independents. And I just think they're done with the Trump brand, and I think they're done with Trump and anything associated with his brand. So there was sort of a sense. I'm not saying there's still a lot of Trump voters out there, and I think there are, but for what Peggy Noonan called in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, the normies did well. The Trump people, quite frankly, did not do well. And then there's one more X factor, which I want Karl to talk about. The Slotkin.
Oh, in the Slotkin race, one of the things that I think will have really made a difference for House Democrats, and I assume Senate Democrats too, but House Democrats particularly, they got out and they were actually knocking on doors this cycle. And they didn't do that in 2020 because of the pandemic, but they got out and they knocked on doors. The DCCC alone, 3 days before Election Day, knocked on 1 million doors across the country. That's really a lot. It's a lot of doors. But that's the type of stuff that can turn close elections. And I think the fact that there was a ground game, that the DCCC had an effective, broad ground game in every single one of these races makes a difference. It makes a difference in 2020 when your opponents are doing it and you're not. It makes a difference when everybody's doing it. And I think in the Slotkin race in particular, you've seen, where she really got out and she knocked on doors and she talked to voters, and that makes a difference in the end.
I'd love to ask a question here before we jump to the next slide. So we talked about Trump's impact on Republican House seats. Do you think that Biden had an impact on the Democratic seats in a positive way? Going into Tuesday, we were all talking about how this might be a referendum on Biden. Did that turn out in the opposite way of like this being a positive reflection, or was it more neutral, would you say, and these other factors played a bigger role?
Kathryn, you want to go first on that, or you want me to do that?
I'll just say, I don't think, my own view is that Biden was not a positive in races. But because you saw candidates like kind of not wanting to appear with him. But I also think, especially for the independent voters, they just don't want anything associated with the Trump brand.
Yeah, and I think, I think the fact that Biden's not Trump is a positive with a lot of people. I think it depends on where you're talking about, Teresa. Was Biden a factor in Pennsylvania? Absolutely. I think he was a factor in Pennsylvania because that's kind of his home. People know him there. He's comfortable there. In some of the Colorado seats, maybe not so much. I think it's district to district, and you kind of saw where Biden was going. And I think the places he was going were places where he was going to have the most effect.
Sure. Wonderful. Thank you. I'll jump to the next slide for you.
Okay, so as you can see, a lot of the, I don't know, some of our stuff is not coming out here. A lot of the races in California have not been called. Those three on the right side that went from D to R are all Florida races. I'm sorry, they're not showing up. Somebody asked about ranked choice voting and Alaska. So if I don't have my numbers right off the top of my head, but basically, if you add up the votes that Palin and Begich get, it's a hefty number and much more than Mary Patola got. But because of ranked choice voting, you have, so if somebody voted for Nick Begich as their #1 pick, it's probably because they hate Sarah Palin. So their second choice is Patola. And if somebody voted for Sarah Palin, maybe their second choice is again Patola, or maybe, I don't know. So that's what happens in that race is, again, if you only had one Republican running, then this would be a Republican seat. But because you have two Republicans running, and you go to people's second choice, that's how Patola wins that seat. I think that was one of the questions from below. You can keep going down through the slides. Let's see. We picked up a seat in Iowa. Republicans picked up a seat in Iowa. We did well in Florida. We did surprisingly well in New York, but I think a lot of that might have to do with redistricting. That was beat Sean Patrick Maloney, who's the head of the DCCC. I don't think the head of a party committee has lost since Guy Vanderjagt in, I want to say 1992 or 1994. So it's been a long time since that happened. That's one where Democrats, in my opinion, in New York got greedy, and then a state court basically said, no, you can't draw seats like, I think they went to like, I don't know, like 22 to 4, 22 Democrats to 4 Republicans or something. And then the state court came in and said, you can't do that. So surprisingly, New York was a very bright spot, and we flipped numerous seats in New York.
And I would just say on top of that, Kathryn, I mean, we were kind of going to election day. I mean, some of the things I was looking for, and a lot of people were looking for in terms of indicators for where this was going. Kathryn already touched on Pennsylvania, but it was those 3 seats in Virginia. It was both the House seats in New Hampshire, but I really want to kind of focus on the Sharice Davids seat, because that was one of the ones where I really wanted to see what the outcome was going to be. Because if Sharice was winning, then I knew this was going to be a much better cycle than we thought it was going to be. That's a very suburban Republican leaning district where Sharice Davids is a phenomenal member of Congress and knows her constituency and knows how to talk to them, knows how to work with them. So if she can overcome the Republican high tide, I guess at this point, then Democrats are going to be overperforming in a midterm election. And so that was one of the big ones for me. I mean, Spanberger was obviously big, New Hampshire was big, but seeing where Sharice Davids was coming out and all this, to me, really indicated that something was happening here that created some momentum for Democrats.
Yeah, and I will say, I know Amanda Atkins, I've met her, she's a good candidate, but I just think that's a state, they just had a referendum on access to abortion. And I think that probably did not help Amanda Atkins in that state. Yeah, in that state. All right, next slide. Again, we see a lot of movement to the Republicans. So this is the next slide is the one that, and I will just say there were a couple races where the Trump endorsed candidate, I mentioned this, did not win. And one of those was this North Carolina 13, I think it was Ted Budd's old seat. Bo Hines was endorsed by Madison Cawthorn, who lost his primary. And I also believe Donald Trump, and he lost to Wiley Nickel. And I think it might be, it's either a just let me look real quick. It's an R+2 seat. So we lost a couple of those R+2 seats because we had a candidate, another one was in Michigan with Peter Meyer, where the incumbent Republican had Trump endorsed candidates, beat them in the primary, and then they lost the general. And you could sort of see that one coming could sort of see that coming a long way. And one other on redistricting, Steve Shavitz lost his seat, Republican, been around for a while. So that one was redistricting, where his seat just went from, I think, D+5, or, predominantly a Democrat seat. Oh, another one we lost because of a Trump endorsed candidate was this Marcy Kaptur seat. That's an R+3. Definitely could have won that, but just didn't have the right candidate in there.
And on North Carolina 13, I just want to jump in and agree with Kathryn and just kind of add to that and say, I think this is one of the seats too, where the old adage that Kathryn touched on before, candidates matter. Candidates really matter. Wiley Nickel was a phenomenal candidate. He worked very hard. He was a blue dog, new Dem that would not let the Republicans suck him into the whole defund the police debate or any of those other kind of distracting issues. And he just focused on what was important in the district. And I think that's why you saw Wiley do well.
All right, next slide.
All right. Leadership races. Lots of
All
questions
right,
here
so this
already
is
in the
what's-
chat.
Yes, this is what's interesting. So Kevin McCarthy is running for speaker. He ran for speaker a few years ago and then pulled out, and then Paul Ryan became speaker. He is currently the Republican leader. The thing you need to know, if you don't know it already, is that you need 218 votes, unlike all the other leadership elections, which are done within a conference meeting, in a private conference meeting. You need 218 votes on the House floor to be speaker. So if your majority is 221 votes, that doesn't give you a lot of room to lose votes on the day you elect the speaker. The people that are giving him the most trouble right now is the House Freedom Caucus, led by Scott Perry. They're demanding concessions. I think a seat at the steering committee table, more House Freedom Caucus members on various committees. Probably the key thing they want to do is so the way it was before when Pelosi took over in 2018 was one member could offer a privilege resolution on the House floor to get rid of the speaker, to vacate the speaker. And the Democrats changed that in their rules. Democrats changed that in their rules to say, no, you need to have a vote of your conference before you are allowed to present that vote on the House floor. McCarthy has said he will not agree to that, and it totally makes sense because that would just leave you open to being blackmailed on any given day. But he's going to have a tough time. Now, we had this conversation in 2020 with Speaker Pelosi because you had a number of people who didn't support her in 2018 and who said they wouldn't support her, and she ended up winning. So clearly McCarthy believes there's still a path for him to be speaker. And more importantly, you can't beat somebody with nobody. And as upset or as frustrated or as much noise as the House Freedom Caucus makes, they don't have a candidate. I don't know that they have a candidate who can get to a majority in the conference meeting. And I don't know that they have, and they certainly don't have a candidate that can get to 218 on the House floor. Somebody just had a question about whether
Democrats would cross over and
yeah, no,
McCarthy. No, that's not going to happen.
No. No. Majority leader, that will be Scalise. He basically said he's not going to challenge McCarthy. Conference chair, that will be Stefanik. The real race is here for majority whip. You've got Tom Emmer, the NRCC chair. And honestly, if he had the night that we thought we were going to have, I think he'd be bringing in a lot of new people who would be grateful to him for having been elected and would support him. Obviously, that's a much smaller number than we thought it was going to be. We have Jim Banks, who is chair of the Republican Study Committee, who is closer to Trump. Whether that helps him or hurts him, it's hard to say. He does have Ashley Hinson, who is a very respected member from Iowa, who is supporting him openly and vocally, and that has to help Jim Banks. And then Drew Ferguson, who is currently the chief deputy whip. Again, the thing to remember here is you only need a majority of the conference. to be elected to those positions. These are not something that's they're I think, ratified on the House floor, but they're not something that it's not a position like Speaker where you need the 218 on the House floor. And by the way, the leadership elections are scheduled for next Tuesday, the 15th. I think they will do presentations on Monday, the 14th, and they will have the elections on Tuesday, the 15th. Are there any other leadership questions in there that?
So I see one, if it's a slim GOP majority, some may say it's due to the 4 New York flips. Does that empower moderate Republicans in the caucus against the Freedom Caucus, the Marjorie Taylor Greenes of the group, or does it just cause more havoc that there's these 2 groups that feel like they have that minority pull as opposed to one?
Well, obviously, once you get past the Speaker's race, yeah, you're going to have to manage. And this was a challenge for the Democrats, and Karl can certainly talk more about this, because those moderate seats, I mean, when I worked for Tom DeLay, I learned, even though he was seen as a, the hammer and very, very conservative and very, very Republican, moderates make the majority. And that's true on either side. Those are the districts that swing back and forth. Those are the districts that you need to make sure that people are getting the votes that they need to get. Pelosi did a very good job, obviously, of keeping people together. And so, that will be Kevin McCarthy's challenge going forward, is to make sure that when they're coming up to vote on things, that they're not walking people off the cliff. And one other point, and I'm probably talking too much about this, but back in, I think, 2010, the Democrats had the majority. They passed Obamacare, they tried to pass some climate legislation, but especially the Affordable Care Act. And they had the White House. So I think Pelosi made the calculation, we are going to walk our moderates off the cliff because we are going to have permanent legal changes because we have the White House. This time, that's not going to happen. You want to, if anything, McCarthy is going to need to build on this majority, not walk these people off the cliff. Okay, there was another question. Oh, how do they know what they're going to do if we don't have the final results by Tuesday? I think they just, my guess is they just assume that they're going to do it and they'll figure it out later. The Republicans will figure out they get to 218 and figure it out later. I mean, it's a lot less problematic. And in that case, I think that McCarthy would stay as whips. I'm sorry, McCarthy would stay as leader, Scalise would stay as whip, and Stefanik would stay as conference chair. I should mention there's also a race for NRCC chair, which is between Richard Hudson and Darren LaHood. I like them both, and they're both friends, and everybody likes them both. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in that race as well. Karl? Oh,
but Kathryn, I think that's a good question for you, just kind of leading into talking about the Democratic races. I assume the way your caucus rules work is McCarthy can still invite to the caucus meeting whoever he wants to invite. I mean, if he's got candidates that aren't declared yet, he can still invite those.
Oh yeah, no, they show up,
right?
And I believe they do vote. Yes.
I mean, the caucus vote is different than with the vote that actually takes place on the floor after
Correct.
everybody's sworn in. What
Right.
happens next week and the week of the 29th for Democrats is really just kind of the test run.
Right.
So interesting question here. Someone asked, what happens if no candidate can get to 218 on the floor? Has there ever not been a speaker?
They've had years where I believe it hasn't had more than one ballot, but that hasn't happened in a while. But certainly something that we will research between now and January.
Wonderful. There are lots of questions, but we're probably never going to get to all of them. So I think we can jump to the next slide here. Democratic House leadership. So another big question.
Great question. And I would start kind of the same place Kathryn started and saying, as of today, Nancy Pelosi has not said anything about what her intentions are or what her future is. So you kind of have to assume going into the week of the 29th, which is when these elections are scheduled, that Nancy Pelosi's still going to be the speaker. Until she says otherwise, why would you speaker or Democratic leader, Why would you assume otherwise until she says something that contradicts that? So if Pelosi decides to stay as Democratic leader, everybody moves down a notch. We've seen that happen before. It's happened in both parties when you lose. But what we have here on the chart here is kind of where Democrats stand in terms of their leadership, and kind of those members who are potentially viewed as the next generation of leadership within the Democratic caucus. We'll see what happens. Again, it's hard to speculate. It's all academic until the speaker announces what her intentions are. Hoyer could certainly move up. Clyburn could certainly move up. We've all heard the rumors that Hakeem Jeffries would want to move up. We've got people below Pelosi who have a great deal of respect and clout within the Democratic caucus and could all make plays for being the Democratic leader, for being the Democratic whip, for being the assistant leader, I guess is what that position becomes. You then go to who the caucus chair would be. Certainly, if it's not going to be Hakeem Jeffries, Joe Neguse gets a lot of talk about him being the next caucus chair. Until Pelosi announces her intentions, you really got to wait and see what happens here. And Kathryn, I don't know if you all do it the same way or not, but what will happen on the 29th is Democrats, the way they do it is they will elect the caucus chair first. People think it's going to be the leader, and it's not. It's the caucus chair, because the caucus chair then has to administer the rest of the elections. So on the 29th of this month, we will have a race for caucus chair. And I think we will know at that point who's running for caucus chair and who's running for everything else. But right now, the slate you're looking at on your screen is the slate that I think you see going forward until somebody announces a vacancy otherwise.
Do you have any sense of who some of the buckets are within the caucus that might align with different leaders if we do have that open spot at the top?
I mean, the biggest caucuses you're talking about here are the CBC, the CHC, the New Dems, the Progressive Caucus. I mean, those are kind of the big four players. If they stick together, if they don't stick together and they fracture, then it really is hard to predict who comes down where. I mean, when you look at a Steny Hoyer or Jim Clyburn, I mean, they've got relationships through all those caucuses, and they've got relationships up and down the caucus. So it's really hard to predict who sticks together and who they rally around in terms of their candidates. So I know, Teresa, the answer to your question is I don't have a good sense for how the blocks would vote, or if they would even vote in block.
Awesome. I will jump to the next slide here. So committee leadership, always lots of questions here.
Yeah, so again, assuming Republicans take over, some of them are set because there's no contest, or they've been in charge and they haven't hit their 6-year limit. So House Administration, that was Rodney Davis, he's gone. Agriculture will be Glenn Thompson, Appropriations Kay, Armed Services Mark Rogers. Budget could be with 3 people: Buddy Carter, Arrington, or Lloyd Smucker. Education and Labor, Virginia Fox needs a waiver. Everybody likes Virginia Fox. There's been a real reluctance to grant waivers, but if anybody would get one, I would think it would be Virginia Fox, partially because everybody's scared of her. On Homeland, it could be Scott Perry or Clay Higgins. You can keep going because the Democrats don't change that much.
Sure.
Just do the next slide.
Next slide.
Yeah. The big race that everybody's paying attention to is for Ways and Means chairman. You've got Vern Buchanan, who has seniority, Jason Smith from Missouri, or Adrian Smith, just to make things a little more complicated. I think a lot of people think it's between, not to say anything bad about Adrian Smith, because everybody really likes Adrian Smith. He's a good member. Probably between Vern Buchanan and Jason Smith are kind of the leading candidates on that. And if Jason is currently the ranking member on budget, so if he doesn't get budget, if he doesn't get Ways and Means, then he would stay at budget, and those names that you saw on budget would no longer be relevant. So that's kind of where we are. Do you want to talk about Democrats, Karl?
Yeah, I mean, you've got a couple of good races here. I'll start with going back to admin. There's not really a lot of drama around House admin, but Zoe Lofgren, who is the chair there right now, She is also in line to take over science if that's what she wants to do. The last I heard, she has not announced what she wants to do, but science is hers if she wants it. Otherwise, she would stay as ranking at House Admin. The couple of good races that I shouldn't say good, but some of the competitive races that Democrats will have for their leadership is certainly at oversight, where Jamie Raskin, Jerry Conley, and Stephen Lynch are going to run against each other. Transportation, where Rick Larson's running against Eleanor Holmes Norton. I mean, you do have some races here that will have some drama, and at this point are just way too early to predict. If Lofgren does not go for science, then I think you have maybe a Bonamici, Haley Stevens race. I think at budget, Brendan Boyle has announced that he wants that, and I think Brendan is very well liked within the caucus. I think it's still unclear as to whether Brian Higgins, who I think is number 2 on the list there, would want to make a play for that or not. So I think you're going to have some Democratic races as well. My guess is those all get settled next year, but I think that's where we kind of are on Democratic leadership within the committees.
Let me just
we
go.
did get a couple
Somebody
questions.
just real quick. Somebody just asked if Simpson would be chair of appropriations. No, that'll still be Kay Granger.
And then another question of if Virginia Fox does not get a waiver, who would be the next person in line?
I knew you were going to ask me that question. Doggone it. And I had it like last week. I looked it up. It's whoever is number 2.
All right.
Thank you, Walbert. Thank you, Kelly Ferguson. Walbert.
And let me see if there were other ones here. We will share slides out after the presentation for everyone asking here as well. Oh, and then I guess this is sort of related to committees, but generally, do you think the Republican conference will continue the practice of community project funding, colloquially earmarks, in the upcoming Congress?
Great question.
Well, I certainly hope so. That's all I'm going to say. Well, I certainly hope so. I mean, it's a weird situation. In my mind, it's always been a weird situation. I mean, specific, what do we call them? Member directed spending has never been the cause of overspending in Congress. And it is my view, and always has been my view, that, and don't get me wrong, there were some pretty idiotic member directed spending requests that went through. You know what? Yeah, members put their names on those, and then they had to sort of stand behind them. So I think they, they feel like they put in, I hope they feel like they put in enough safety guardrails to make sure the member directed spending is not abused. And I will say that the other problem is, like, so when it's not directed by members who elected by Congress, then you have these unelected bureaucrats. And if you think that's not a political process, you're crazy, because then those, no offense, those projects go to how to, what Democrat member needs help, or what area of the country needs help, or, what state that is a swing state that needs help. So it's not like it took away the abuse. It just made it a little less obvious, in my opinion. I have not heard anybody saying that, but I suppose it's a possibility.
Sure. And then do we have another slide here, or is this the last one?
I think that's it for us.
I would love to, while we've got a couple more minutes, dive into some policy questions of what areas of priorities that folks might see. So one question that's coming up is, like, what happens to the end of the year? What things get approved or not approved, and where we sit for the next couple of months?
I'll start out by saying December is going to be awful. Don't make any plans. The first 3 weeks particularly are going to be really bad. So if you think you're going to have a good December, it's not going to work out that well.
Yeah, so they have to get the CR done. The CR expires December 16th, which I think is a Friday or a Saturday. I think it's a Friday. So they have to fund the government before then. There's been some talk, well, this depends on who's in charge. I mean, I assume Republicans want to clear the decks, and I think that Democrats would want to the extent possible, have their spending priorities become law before Congress switches over. I think they need to get NDAA done. National Defense Authorization Act needs to get done. There's been some talk of the Senate focusing on some, if the Senate does flip, or they think it's going to flip, then the Senate Democrats would have some more work on getting judicial nominations pushed through. We will have a slide on that later in the deck. There was talk about doing the same-sex marriage vote, which had been sort of postponed, and then there was one other one. Let me just look at let me look at my slides, which are later in the deck. Hold on. Let's see. There might be effort to do the electoral count reform bill, and then there is talk. Somebody asked. There is talk of doing tax extenders, but attaching them to an omnibus appropriation bill or NDAA.
We're getting a number of questions about the farm bill. What are the prospects of a farm bill in 2023?
Well, they need to do one. As people who do the farm bill know, that it gets delayed sometimes. Somebody else mentioned debt ceiling. It's not clear whether debt ceiling will happen before the end of the year or sometime next year. If I were the Democrats, I would leave that in the lap of the Republicans to do, but that's just me. Farm bill, I was at an event with GT Thompson a while back, and he said that they really have not, normally they have, I don't know if it's hundreds of hearings, but it's certainly dozens of hearings on farm bill issues. And he was of the view that they were a bit behind on that. So I think that is something they want to get done, but they need to, they've got a lot of work to do to really flesh out the issues. One other thing I want to say is the Republicans don't plan on naming committee chairman until after the speaker vote is over, which means, and then they certainly are not going to be putting people on committee until after the speaker vote is over, and that is the beginning of January, and the steering committee will meet. So it will be somewhat of a late start in terms of getting the committees up and running. And then, of course, with the margins being the way they are, they're going to have to probably argue a bit about committee ratios, although I suspect they would just say, all right, well, whatever you had, we'll just flip it back and forth, except for the rules committee.
And Kathryn, go back to the farm bill. I would argue that politically, that's not something anybody wants to fail. So the question is, how does it come together? And I would also argue, assuming that the Republicans are in the majority, who is Kevin McCarthy negotiating with? Is it Chuck Schumer or is it Mitch McConnell? Because that too is going to have a big impact in terms of how the negotiations of that go forward.
Yeah. And my understanding is a fair amount of the farm bill is bipartisan. But then you get to some of the nutrition programs and it gets ugly quickly. So
and that's where the speaker and the Senate leader have to figure things out.
Yeah.
A number of questions about DACA and prospects for DACA with the current state of the chamber.
It's going to be all you, Karl.
Well, if it's a Republican majority in the House and a Democratic majority in the Senate, I don't see how that happens. I think there's still going to be a lot of pressure for it. I mean, I think that's definitely a place where the White House is going to spend some energy. But I just, especially in 2023, I don't see how you can bring those two chambers together in an agreement around that.
By the way, people are putting in the chat or the questions like all kinds of legislation that's going to happen. We're just focusing at this point on what's likely to get done by the end of the year, what needs to get done by the end of the year, and what they've talked about doing by the end of the year. Doesn't mean a couple cats and dogs won't get thrown in if they can reach agreement on it, but they're going to want to get done what they need to get done and get the hell out of Dodge, is my guess.
So we're coming up at the end of time. As a closing question that might be a can of worms here. It's not out of the realm of possibility that we have a 1 or 2 seat majority, as we've talked about on either side. What does that look like? We talked for the past 2 years about Joe Manchin being that swing vote in the Senate who controls things. Is there that one person who holds that power if there's a 1-seat majority? What happens if somebody dies or resigns or in the middle of the chamber? How do we even approach a 1-seat swing if that scenario happens?
Very carefully. So I worked for House leadership when I think we had a 6-vote margin. And what it meant was everybody had to stay together. You literally could not afford to lose anyone. And that obviously makes it a challenge. I don't know what happens, you know, so I'm sure it's happened before. Maybe it hasn't. If somebody dies in the middle of the session, or we pray for everybody's good health. So I think it'll be fun. Well, I'm not gonna say it's gonna be fun to watch, but it'll be interesting to watch. But you need everybody. That's the challenge. You need everybody to hang together, and you need strong leadership to figure out what you need to get done. Part of the problem we had in 2010, I think, was there were a bunch of Republicans who were like, well, whatever the Republican leadership was proposing, they were like, well, that's not good enough. You know, we want more. And so you're like, all right, I appreciate you want more, but the choice is between what we're able to get with 218 votes and what the other party wants to get. And there were a couple times where Republicans ended up getting less than what they could have, because at the time it was some of the Tea Party folks were like, no, we can't vote for this middle ground. And it's like, all right, well, then we're handing power to Nancy Pelosi and she will get more of her priorities. And they were sort of fine with that, because they're like, well, but we didn't have to vote for the middle ground because we only want to win. They see it more like a football game where at the end there's a score, who scored the most touchdowns, that's all that counts. And just didn't get what's the best you can get here in the face of the political realities.
And I think that's a great question, Teresa. I mean, but the fact of the matter is, here with margins this close in both chambers, nobody's got a mandate. Nobody's got a mandate to do anything. I mean, there were no overriding issues that really determined the outcome of this campaign. I mean, fixing inflation, fixing gas prices, taking care of woman's right to choose. I mean, you could talk about all those things in broad political context, but there was no theme of what happened here in terms of providing one party or the other a mandate for how they should be governing.
Yeah, and that hand-to-hand combat visual that you described earlier, I think
it's really noteworthy that normally you have an election and somebody's gloating. Yeah, I haven't really seen much gloating. I mean, obviously the White House is happy that things weren't nearly as bad as they thought they were going to be, which is hardly gloating. Republicans are chastened because they did not do nearly as well as they thought they would. So you don't really have, like Karl said, you don't really have anybody like, we have a mandate and we're going for it. It's like it's not quite a status quo election, because there are certainly undercurrents moving in different directions. But it's probably is pretty close to a status quo election in terms of where we're going to end up that we've seen in a long time.
Yeah, the could have been worse message is not exactly generating victory parades anywhere.
Yeah, right.
And then, Karl, I guess one closing question for you before we jump here. I don't think many Democrats, aside from what Nancy Pelosi said in the press, expected any likelihood of keeping the House. If that short runway ends up being true, what's one thing that comes back on the table that nobody was talking about, that they have some possibility of moving on with a potential Democratic House and Senate again? What's that one thing that we see come back to the negotiating table if that unexpected scenario comes through?
Well, I definitely think choice could be one of those issues. I think everybody who survived this cycle had that at least part of their message. I think we saw that in the exit polls, that it was important. So you could see something rally around that. I would say one of the big surprises, I think if the margins are that close and the Democrats eke it out, Nancy Pelosi stays as speaker. I don't know if she's going to do that anyways, but I think if the Democrats hang on to the majority, she stays as speaker because she provides the continuity a very marginalized caucus will need.
But didn't she say she would step down from leadership after this?
Yeah, under Teresa's scenario, I don't think she envisioned having 219 votes in this Congress.
Well, any predictions on when we'll have a call? When?
I don't know. Just pray for those people in California and or Washington and Oregon and Arizona, and I don't know what's taking them so long, but
I mean, there's still 4 million votes in California they have to count. I mean, this could be a while.
And maybe, I think lots of folks have been talking about, maybe it's an expectation setting change that we shouldn't expect to know on election night anymore. And that's kind of should be the norm rather than being considered atypical with the way things go these days with mail-in.
I can't disagree, although I have to say, Florida so I'm a Florida resident now. Florida brings in the votes, counts them, has them all out. And I think that's probably, I just think you have a lot more certainty with the election process when you can get pretty close to election day. And when it drags out for a week, it certainly gives people cause. I think Peggy Noonan said, my cousin's nephew's girlfriend saw somebody stuffing a ballot box. Like it just creates atmosphere for people to think that something's going wrong. And we don't need that right now.
Yeah, that's a good call out. And maybe technology continues to improve and we learn to adopt it in these kinds of scenarios. Well, thank you so much. I think we could have gone on for the whole time just speaking on the House. There's so much to dive into here. So thank you so much to Karl and Kathryn for their time. We're going to take about 10 minutes to talk about some strategies that you can use for your organization to implement while you negotiate with this slim majority, either way that it goes. And then at 1 o'clock, we will kick off with our Senate panelists. So please stick with us here and we will be on at 1 o'clock with Todd and Dimitri. So thank you, Kathryn and Karl.
Thank you. That's great.
So for the next 8 minutes before we jump into talking about the Senate, I want to talk about some strategies, ways that Quorum can help with implementing as you negotiate with this new Congress. And so the first one that I'm going to present for these 8 minutes or so is the idea of a policy reputation calendar. Now, some of you who have been on Quorum webinars before have heard us talk about this concept where you're really doing proactive communication and not waiting until a member of Congress is voting or sponsoring a bill that really impacts your organization to build that communication relationship with them. So there's really a few ways to implement this process. At the beginning, it's just taking your organization to send a monthly themed email to those lists of stakeholders in Congress. At an intermediate level, you get into segmentation, where you send based on committee memberships, based on seniority, based on region, based on the issues that those people have sway over. And then at an advanced level, you bring more channels beyond email, like social media or events. So this policy reputation calendar template, you can find it at our website. But really the idea is each month you have a theme that you organize your message around so that you have a better chance of really pushing that message through rather than kind of one-off communications. By building your brand through these communications, you then have better chance of your emails getting opened when you do have that ask of a representative for a vote and they're not hearing from you for the first time. Or maybe even on the other end of the spectrum, they're coming to you when they want to learn more about those issues. So some ideas of themes that we see folks organizing their communications around. So in January, it's usually a really high level, introduce your organization to the new Congress. Teach them who you are, what your key focus area is, and who your audience is. Who are your employees? Who are your advocates? Who are your association members? Other themes that folks might send those concentrated communications around include things like veterans during November right now, like today on Veterans Day. It might be a new product launch, a new facility opening. Or it could be something that's not tied to a specific time of year and is just a big report that you're launching or focusing on your team's DEI initiatives. We recommend doing this now because that means that when those kind of in the moment rapid response communications come up, this strategy doesn't fall to the wayside, that you really spent the time planning out in advance and can keep that train on the tracks of proactive communication, even when the votes are coming to the floor and things, or something happens in current events that impact your issue. So one of the features in Quorum that can help folks do this is our integrated email tool, which is called Outbox. With Outbox, you can send newsletters, you can send simple plain text emails, but what really sets it apart is that you can personalize those emails at scale. So you'll see here, I can add in recipient first name. So it looks like it's personalized to them, even if I'm sending to hundreds of people. One of the things we see a lot of folks doing this time of year is personalizing with their custom data. So including in these emails how many facilities you have in a given district or how many advocates that live in that representative's district. So you can really catch their attention with an email that's personalized to them. So this is especially important in a year like now, where with redistricting, Even if there's a member who has served in the legislature before, they might newly represent a key factory or a key facility because of the newly drawn lines. That segmentation really is the secondary step to making this strategy more advanced. We see folks segment by issue, such as every staffer with agriculture in their issue portfolio, segmenting by staff roles, such as press secretaries and communications directors when you want them to know about a new communications campaign, or by beginner and advanced. So you might send a more simplistic overview of your issues to staffers who don't sit on the key committee, but have that in their portfolio, or a more in-depth explainer of why they should act a certain way if they are on the key committee. Next, talking about how Quorum can help you organize those lists for your segmentation. So this here is my representative in Massachusetts, Patrick Kearney. And in Quorum, you can set your alignment and priority for those folks to build those lists. And that alignment, you can even take to a more advanced step with issue-based alignment. So for example, if Representative Kearney is a champion on one issue in my portfolio, but maybe a detractor on another one, with Quorum, we can set those more specific levels of alignment. You can see I can add him to an issue in my issues management so that he gets emails about one of those particular issues in my portfolio. So lots of features here to help with that list segmentation. And then finally, you can expand your policy reputation calendar by including other channels beyond email. Events are really a big one that we see a lot of folks diving into. And the reason is that events are really telling of someone's level of engagement. If they're willing to take time out of their day to attend one of your events, that means they're really going to be at a high level of engagement, and you can use that to gauge how you can utilize that relationship in the future. And then also social media. We see lots of organizations growing their policy social media accounts, like Toyota, Fidelity, IBM, who all have specific accounts narrowly tailored to their government affairs teams. Now, of course, people's behavior on Twitter might be changing in the coming months, but the big thing here is to meet folks where they are. Staffers are on social media more than they are watching the news. This might be a good channel for you over some of your more traditional media. So really thinking about diversifying your channels to meet the needs of your stakeholders. And then here is just a look of how you can divide this up over the course of the month. Now, we're at 12:59, so thank you for listening to a little bit of speed around there as we had so many questions. I'm going to answer 2 questions on our policy reputation calendar, and then we will turn it over to Dimitri and Todd to start telling us more about the Senate. Who would you suggest is the best person to send the monthly theme message? So I think that's really could go either way. I think Chief of Staff, Legislative Director are both good options. Honestly, what you could start with at the beginning of the year is start with a big list. And then as you see who tends to engage with them, narrow it down. Quorum does track who's opening and engaging with your emails, so you can sort through that and see who tends to find the most interest and engagement with this. And let me continue nurturing those relationships. How often are staff or contacts updated? We are doing that on a very regular basis. And something that makes Quorum unique is that we are collecting that information also from our clients. So along with our data providers, we have a feature where customers, when they get a bounce back email from a staffer or they learn new information, they can report that themselves. So that means that we have a ground team of thousands of users who are helping to keep our data